Thank you very much, David and Akbar, for the invitation and for the organization of the event, which is great fun. I'm going to talk a little bit for about 45 minutes to an hour about some work that I've been doing with colleagues that is in China. As I said in my introduction, I'm not a China specialist. I would not pretend to be a China specialist. I've had the privilege to spend some time in the last couple of years doing some work here on a project with colleagues, which I think the spirit of which is one informed by a notion that we might learn from China that the forms of urbanism, urban cultures, in the context of today's and this fortnight's experience, Chinese design might speak to an experience in the West rather than transport concepts, notions, analytical frames from the West and impose them on China. It is in a sense an attempt to invert certain things, but it is informed by dialogue. It's informed largely by work over the last couple of years in discussion with a number of planners, architects, the migrant floating population, which I'm not going to be talking about very much today, and others, but it also is informed by the work of other colleagues, notably Scott Lash, Jacob Arnoldi, and a postdoctoral research fellow, Dr. Tailaruka Lutai, who's been based in Shanghai for the last 2.5 years, carrying out various ethnographies, including a long ethnography of the stock market and a long ethnography of a development company in Shanghai. I put together this talk last night. It's hopefully responds to the frames that Akbar and David set up yesterday in the East End of London. When somebody says they're going to frame you, they don't always mean quite the same thing as I guess David and Akbar did yesterday. It has a certain different connotation, but in that spirit, what I'll try to do is engage with some of the discussion from yesterday, and I hope the technology will bear with me, verifying, if you like, my allegory yesterday. It came back to bite me this morning when we found a degree of incompatibility between my subservience to Bill Gates and the Californian hegemony of Apple, I guess. However, on to the talk. The talk is a talk in 5 parts with a brief introduction, but the 5 parts include a prelude, which is the arrival of the stranger, a first part on metonyms, metaphors in the city of bits in Shanghai, a third part on the Mobius Strip of China modern, thinking about Shenzhen speed, a fourth part about paradoxical space, externalities in Bin Laden city, Tianjin, and a fifth part, a return to Shanghai, and some thoughts on branded urbanism in the design logos of the 21st century. There is a slideshow that will go with each in the background, which I hope will inform what I'm saying and broadly time, though not exactly with what I'm saying. Okay, the introduction, as I say, my position is that of no sense of a China specialist. The kinds of work that I'm interested in, the kinds of forms of urbanism, the kinds of political theory that I engage in, nevertheless do valorize at times the eyes of the stranger, and it's in that spirit that the rest of the talk is offered to you. I want to begin with three sets of quotes. The first, those people who are from China. I can only apologize. My Chinese is awful. I've tried over the last 2 years to learn intensively at various times, but I again aspire to Beckett's fail again, fail better, I suppose. However, 5 axioms to begin with that on the slide. Budao Beijing, Bujidao Ziji Guanzhou. Budao Shanghai, Bujidao Shajiao Zhang Balao. Budao Shenzhen, Bujadao Ziji Chanchao. Budao Tianjin, Bujadao Shajiao Shui Sui. Wow. And I probably shouldn't have used this one, but Budao Chongqing, Bujadao Ziji Jiwan Zhao. Those 5 axioms are, if you don't go to Beijing, you don't know how low your official position is. If you've never been to Shanghai, you don't know what a bumpkin is. If you don't go to Shenzhen, you don't know how little money you earn. If you don't go to Tianjin, you don't know what the good of socialism is. And if you don't go to Chongqing, you know you're married too young. The point, straightforwardly, is that the variations of urbanism in China are profound. So when the second of the opening quotes I wanted to use, which is that of Ma Qinyong, the architect colleague, has practiced just down the road from where we are now, but also a professor in California, makes a claim that there is no such thing as public space in China. We might also want to think through that seriously. And the third quote I want to open with is from a couple of China scholars whose names it doesn't matter so much, but when talking about the debate which was prominent in China studies about 7-8 years ago about civil society and a putative emergence of civil society in China, they said when thinking about the debate about whether civil society, public sphere exists in China, for instance, both sides of the debate largely assumed that for China to successfully democratize, there must be a Western style of autonomous space for public and political activity. Optimists would examine a Starbucks in Shanghai, find 2 intellectuals having a conversation and proclaim, "Eureka, they are following our road to democracy." Pessimists, by contrast, would lament, "They're discussing the best way to make money in China's new economy, not politics. China will never democratize." Notably, both sides of this civil society debate often shared the assumption that political change in China must resemble that experienced in the West, dismissing the possibility that China may take a very different road to political development. And so I suppose what informs the talk, and I'll try and, while Shane's doing that, I'll just again, the final acknowledgement I should make is that parts of the conversation are also informed by one of the colleague collaborators in Shanghai, Professor Wang Xiaoming, whose work people may know, who's a center for the study of urban cultures in Shanghai, and whose work is very much informed by a notion of trying to make sense of a China modern. If you like, a project that I think in a way echoes that of his former colleague, Professor Leo Li, who I know will be speaking to us later on today, who tries in his book Shanghai Modern to describe the kinds of imaginaries that structure the early 20th century in Shanghai. Xiaoming, in his work, takes if you like, a Platonic notion of knowing thyself to try to make sense of the common sense of everyday cultures in today's China. The point being that China becomes a stranger, for Xiaoming, in Xiaoming's written work, China becomes a stranger to itself when the pace of change happens so rapidly that you never know what tomorrow's culture may be. So, for example, the road on which this hotel is based, Huaihuailu, runs from west-east in Shanghai along an axis that has extraordinary social dimensions as well as a geographical spread. And one of Xiaoming's projects in his center is to make sense of the everyday cultures of an invisible Shanghai that never reaches the pages of the press or the gaze of many academics. It is actually a project that's partly informed by an emulation of the project around Stuart Hall's cultural studies in the early days of the 1970s. Just bear with me for a second. Yesterday we began with Yao Ming. Today we begin with another familiar figure, David Beckham. The point being that the iconographies of Shanghai, I want to kind of cut against slightly Achille's comment that we might distinguish between the monumental, the pharaonic, and the everyday or the ordinary. I want to try and, if you like, find the monumental in the everyday to an extent, but also try and undermine slightly some of our ways of thinking about both the familiar and the strange in the cultures of urbanism of today's China. There is an iconography, and I'll let the iconography run in the background, and part of it was touched on yesterday. Part of it you can see in the casinos of Macau. Part of it you see in the pages of the FT's advertisement for an almost Koolhaasian generic urbanism, which itself almost mimics a landscape which you can see just down the road. So there is an iconography to this story, but it's an iconography which, if you like, is a background. What I instead want to think about is this notion, just for a second, of arrival. There's a film that Michael Winterbottom made. I don't know if many people have seen it, called Code 46, where the protagonist, Tim Robbins, actually arrives in a generic city of the future. The future of urbanism for Winterbottom is Shanghai, but the film is produced through this almost Koolhaasian frame of reference, where the future city is a fusion of parts of Dubai, parts of Shanghai, parts of the outskirts of Delhi, all of which are kind of pasted together in, if you like, a Levi-Straussian bricolage way, which produces a generic urbanism, but it also ties us to this notion of the arrival of the stranger who cannot know, whose eyes cannot see, whose tradition, if you like, almost invokes the Bildungsroman. We know that the arrival in the city is a familiar trope that makes sense of oneself through making sense of the signs and the impossibility at times to read the sign. It goes back to Goethe, it goes back to Dickens, it has various correlates across the world, but in a sense what I want to try to argue that there is something in the nature of contemporary urbanism that is fundamentally unknowable, profoundly unknowable, because the pace of change, the spread of culture, produces not so much, if you like, a situationist understanding of sur le trottoir, la plage, but more, if you a sense of, if you like, behind the matrix. The plurality, the pace of change, the rapidity with which urban form transforms itself actually begins to question not just the multiplicity of perspectives, the production of spaces and spatialities, but also the fundamental ways in which we are continually arriving in a city that is strange. So if we almost, if you like, begin to go back to that sense which I tried to introduce from Xiaoming, of a notion of making sense of the everyday. It is fine to think through the iconographies of the kutsa, the trousers people call it in Beijing, the building Koolhaas's CCTV that there was a lot of discussion on yesterday. It's fine to think about the bird's nest. It's fine to think of these kind of icons of contemporary urbanism in China, or for that matter in London, New York, and so on. But if we're beginning to think about the project of designing, of making, of fabricating, we might actually want to think a little more seriously about the ways in which, if you like to use a kind of shorthand, we combine that sense of overwhelming novelty, the sensorium that Achille was talking about, that notion that I tried to kind of maybe move us towards a little bit, if you like, a Zimalian sense of the 21st century urban cultures, of what kinds of rationalization, what kinds of edit, what kinds of cut and paste make sense of the multi-mediated city of the 21st century. Then we might move towards both, if you like, kind of Heidegger plus Latour, if we want a kind of chemical equation for this, that actually begins to think about what it means to dwell anew in a changing sense of instability, that brings together objects and bodies cultures and things in continuously newly produced, newly hybridized combinations that characterize an everyday urbanism of the 21st century, that doesn't in any way detract from a sense of either the monumental or the ordinary, but actually finds the monumental in our everyday life in slightly strange ways. If you like, again, just to signal the last time that Leo Lee's book, he tries to make the argument that trope, Vidler's trope of the uncanny, the sense in which the familiar is potentially always defamiliarized in the city of modernity. And he argues that there's a kind of Shanghai vernacular modernity that makes the uncanny present in a way that's kind of generic and increasingly formed by the new spaces of Shanghai. We might almost think of the uncanny as the default position of today's cities, not least in China, but again reflecting back on ourselves, understanding that in these new assemblages of bodies and things, there is potentially, going back to the readings that informed that people were talking about yesterday, there is potentially a biopolitical logic to how we think about the subjects that are always emerging, the subjects that are simultaneously designed cultures and bodies that emerge through the spaces and places of the city, but that these have a particularly genealogical logic to it. And so the second scholar that I referenced and thanked, deeply influenced a lot of what's in this paper, Shui Zhiyuan, who's based partly at Beidar, partly at Cornell, tries to make an argument that when you're thinking of the everyday cultures of China, you need to take seriously the notion of market socialism. When Akbar was talking yesterday about the oxymoronic nature of market socialism and its surreal form, I suppose what I'd want to just push a little bit, I'm trying to set what I'm saying against what was said yesterday for provocation rather than disagreement for its own sake, if you like. But what I'd try and maybe push us a little bit today, and this is thinking that if you go back to the surreal, if you take, say, again, Benjamin's reading of the surreal was that the enchantment of the surreal was something that was a shock. The idea of the shock of the surreal was to wake up, to understand the totality. Whereas I think in the condition of the 21st century, if the totality is so multiple, not purely in a kind of relativistic terms, my position is, if you like, a form of anti-relativism, but we'll come back to that maybe. What I try and suggest to you, that rather than a straightforward notion of the surreal urbanism of China, that the promise that we might awake and understand the reality, come out of the enchanted forest, as Benjamin put it, to understand the logic of the whole city, will always be an illusion, will always be elusive. But what we can do, and this is, I guess, Shui Zhiyuan's project, is understand the path dependency through which assemblages are made that owe their legacy to a particular set of property rights. In his work, Zhiyuan draws from, if you like, an interrogation of 19th century debates about the fundamental nature of property to an organization of the social, the political, and the cultural. So he returns to Lassalle, he returns to Proudhon, he returns to Mead, Mill, Locke, to try and, if you like, reinterpret what he describes, not as just contemporary China, but an emergent subjectivity in China that he describes. I suppose it's, most evocatively he has a phrase where he says a spectre is haunting China. It is the spectre of petty bourgeois socialism. And if we actually begin to take seriously what that means, we might begin to think about continually arriving anew in the city. And so I wanted to kind of start in Shanghai. Beckham Corner is a name that's given by friends of mine who live here to a large shopping center. It's the second largest shopping center after Nanjinglu, which is about 3 or 4 miles to the west of here. Second largest shopping center in Shanghai. It is, if you like, that the figure of Beckham's stayed there in that massive poster for about a year and a half, 2 years, which is a long time, I think, in Shanghai, and became a landmark in its own sense. And I suppose I thought of it when people were invoking Yao Ming. But what I want to do in moving on to part 2 is think about this notion of metonymy and metaphor that David and Sarah evoked yesterday. The simple argument I want to make in the context of this fortnight is that if a notion of the rational, organized, modern project of the city beautiful, the city improved, becomes an impossibility, or at least a horizon, we might start thinking a little bit about how that project of designing and urban space comes together through an alternative language. And I suppose what interests me in part of the work that we've been doing is how the city of bits becomes designed, becomes planned. What this says about the kind of conventional rhetorics of the will to power, but what it says about systemic thinking in the early 21st century. I suppose when Sarah was talking yesterday, she invoked a notion of the metonymic and the metaphoric in terms of its verticality or horizontality. But I suppose what I'd want to at least kind of put up for just a little bit of discussion is a sense of how the piece and the whole comes together in the metonym, not least in cultural form, precisely because I want to suggest that one of the ways we might learn from China is that sometimes by default, sometimes by intent, the inability, the kind of collapse of the 20th century Enlightenment-inspired social engineering of the city in its Keynesian welfare state form or in its socialist state form to produce the rational, well-organized city has almost produced by default a notion of the planning of the bits of the city. It privileges a kind of architectural and planning discourse of the master plan, the small piece of the city that then becomes representative of supposedly a relationship metonymically between the piece and the whole, and yet we are never quite sure of what the whole is. There's extraordinary pace. I did an interview with people who were involved in planning the master plan for the World Expo site at the same time as I was on the planning committee that was establishing, in my political hat, the Olympics in London for 2012. And those two things were happening simultaneously in my life. And what was interesting about the planners in Shanghai, who came out of Tongxi, who were both academics and simultaneously professional planners, was that we interviewed them once, and in the middle of the interview they won the contract for the plan. We interviewed them again 3 months later, and the plan was completed, finished, signed off and passed. And in the same period of time, we just about managed to move from the stage of acknowledging that we might need a planning process for the Olympics in London to the stage where we were almost about to set it up. The pace of technocratic approach to the city, I suppose, is one that is, at a different kind of speed, but also the function of the plan. There was a discussion yesterday, I suppose, about the interplay between risk and uncertainty. And again, I was thinking about this last night. You might think, if you take Frank Knight, the economist, his argument was the whole function of the discipline of economics was to transform the incalculability of uncertainty into the calculability of risk. And there is a construction, if you like, a Knightian construction of risk, which is about the notion of the calculable that sits uneasily with a creative notion that might privilege an aesthetics of the event, but also might think about the ways in which the creativity of design either is or is not articulated. But what I'd want to try and suggest is that in China, if you like, the tentative nature of the plan is actually not quite so strange as my kind of caricature of a second ago wants to suggest. A friend of mine worked with Zaha Hadid on the master planning of the Singapore IT zone, and he teaches theory at AA and has a take on the plan, which goes along the lines of if you follow most architectural textbooks or most planning textbooks, the notion is that you have a plan that you build. We might actually think slightly differently about the plan, the design of the city, if we think about it instead as an intervention in a debate. And his argument is that if you ever build a plan, if you ever build a master plan, then you have singularly failed in what you are trying to do. That the point of the master plan is to intervene in a discussion, it's to provoke a debate. It is an iterative process, but through which there is this transformation in part of uncertainty into risk. It produces a kind of framing. But it's a kind of framing with some slightly paradoxical moments to it. So that there were some images there of Dongtan, the eco-city that was again mentioned yesterday, which is to the east of China. John Prescott and Tony Blair, people may know, kind of came and signed off Dongtan eco-city to great acclaim in the UK at least, because Arabs, the UK company, are very much involved in the design, the architecture and the build of the city. And there's a whole kind of series of debates which we can't go into. This is we spent some time with a colleague Zhang Jun from Urban China on Chongming Island, interviewing some of the people who had actually been displaced from Three Rivers Dam, the Three Rivers Dam project, onto the island. But also, in spite of its idealism, in spite of all sorts of very positive things, I don't want to just kind of critique the Dongtan project. The kind of insularity, literally, on an island of the project just to the east of Shanghai, kind of ignored the Ricardian implications of what is happening at the moment. Is that you build the bridge that joins Chongming Island to Shanghai, and suddenly you put on the bridge no mass transit, but instead a car system. And all of a sudden the eco-city is the piece of the city in its relationship, its whole, is undermined by some of the kind of very basic ecologies of urban travel. The city is, if you like, always on the move. And I just want to come back. If you look at this site, two other examples before I move on to the next part of the city. The next part of the talk. This is Morgan Shanlo. If you get a chance to go down there, actually, I might just stop it there for 1 second. It's effectively the kind of the Chijiuba, the art district of which is the art district in Beijing. It's kind of its nearest equivalent in Shanghai. It exists almost by default because a number of artists, designers set the space up in, as you would find in many parts of the world, a kind of disused, unwanted space in one of the more ephemeral parts of the city, close to the river. It hasn't been displaced in spite of the way in which the city is continually on the move, and you might expect it to be. Why has it not been displaced? Well, when you begin to look at it closely, and again, we haven't got time to go into the story in detail, you talk to people there, and the developers of these sites, you can see literally towering over the kind of art district in the background, wanted to take the land, but the land was part of an old Danwei, an old state-owned enterprise organization that tied into the army. The Danwei system means that property holding relates directly through national forms. Property development is, again, some people will know a lot about this and maybe some others much less. I'm not quite sure about how much detail is helpful to go into, but I'm happy to go into more in discussion. The point is that land remains forever socialized. A law passed 2 years ago creates a different notion of property, but still the land, you buy the use rights on the land. One of the ways we might think about land is as a bundle of rights that is therefore contested and is frequently constructed through fuzzy rather than categoric property rights. And in this case, in one of those examples of fuzzy property rights, effectively what happens is where the SOE's power tied into the old Red Army generation, many of whom had retired, paradoxically, I guess, kind of save the art space because they are concerned about the ways in which the city is moving, the ways in which the city is developing, the kinds of development that was mooted on the site itself. In another site that there were some images of, as Shanghai expands, of course, the urban mass grows exponentially. Commensurably, though, as people again around the room will know, Property rights in China differentiate in a fairly hard way between the urban and the rural. In the cities, the forms of, whereas in the countryside, ownership exists in one form. In the cities, you buy land use rights. But as the city expands, then frequently what you find is that the old village areas, such as the one that's just here, become overtaken by the growth of the city. Quite literally, what was a village becomes overtaken. And this is just on the outer ring road of Shanghai, and what you find is in the old village, though the village itself becomes a small site of ownership, frequently in this case concentrated with migrant workers, and a completely different form. It is, if you like, a village in the city that begins to concentrate migrant workers in particular pockets, but also juxtaposes one kind of urbanism with another. The point to try and make is that in this city of bits, we have to understand that genealogy of political subjects, which is partly tied to land use rights, and we'll return to this in Shenzhen in just a second. I want to take us to Shenzhen, that city that was again touched on yesterday as the design capital of China by Yung Ho. And in the south of China, spread almost like a toothpaste smear on top of Hong Kong, this pace of change in Shenzhen is extraordinary. It's a city that people, again, many people around the room will know, grew from almost nothing, 250 small villages, to a city of somewhere, depending on how you measure the size, of 18 or so million people in 30 years. It's also a city in which the villages in the city, instead of being on the periphery, become part of the heart of the city itself. This becomes significant because most people live there. These spaces, the Chongjunsuen, become these tiny concentrations of extraordinary densities of population. They're seen as problematic, and yet as colleagues at Urbanus Architects made when they kind of did a study of this a few years ago for Shenzhen local government, there is an argument that is now almost a kind of received wisdom, that in spite of being seen as problematic, these villages amidst the city become actually quite workable as forms of functioning urbanism. They're not designed as such, but they represent some of the greatest densities of population you will find on the planet. If you look at just some of the scales of development, you have apartments that are frequently known as handshake apartments, because you can literally reach out from across the alleyways. But they also can be concentrations of particular forms of economic work. I just want to touch on Dafen. Dafen, people may have heard a little bit about, but a phenomenal proportion of all the oil paintings you'll find in the world are produced in Dafen. It's known as the oil painting village. It has a particular history to it, but in this small village, people brought together. You can buy a box load of Van Goghs. You can buy 300 Picassos. And if you go to a hotel room in almost any place in the world, the odds are that when you go there, the paintings that you will find will have been produced at Dafen, which some of the images are. And it has a particular history it ties into. It's won a number of awards as a kind of centre of cultural industries, but it begins to traumatize, I suppose, just a little bit. That notion of the copy, I don't think anybody was suggesting yesterday that we kind of went back to kind of simple debate about what's fake and what's true. But in a sense, what's interesting about Dafen is you have this whole mass export emerging from the village in the city, which is entirely tied into a notion of reproduction as copying. As I say, you can get different kinds of genre. So you will have, you can see on some of the slides, you will have postmodern painting factory. You will have a factory that produces entirely Turners. And so, some of these forms of being, if you like, I think bring together a different sense of the cultural artifact, but also something that is not straightforwardly either exoticized or made strange, but emerges through the possibilities, the spaces that are generated through the Chongjunsuen system. It is actually also a system that you find as the Juweiwei, the resident owners of the villages in the city, were allowed, when Dong set up the special enterprise zone in Shenzhen. It was one of the first SEZs, first generation SEZs. Basically what they decided to do was allow the villages to continue their system of ownership. And that system of ownership, which I don't think can be characterized straightforwardly as either private or public. There's the point where it's Shui's phrase that to understand the hybridization of these forms in contemporary China, for better and for worse, he makes an argument that you have to understand them as a Mobius strip, as a form of intertwining of public and private, state and market. And this is exactly the kinds of space that emerges in the Chongjunsuen, which makes possible certain kinds of dynamism, which makes possible certain kinds of change, which makes possible certain kinds of design. But in the Juweiwei themselves become kind of small families that frequently have extraordinary wealth. So that in Dafen, what happened was that the wealth that has been produced by this greatest concentration of oil painting in the world is that the clans, the families that owned the villages in the city, actually quite literally bought a new village somewhere else in Shenzhen. So there is also Dafen Chinzun, the new village, which is quite a distance, about 6-7 miles away from Dafen, which is where all the families now live. So you can actually, there's a slide that you can see shortly where effectively 5-6 miles away you have a replication of the old village. There are also kind of interesting stories when just outside the SEZ, the old boundary, which used to have very straightforward kind of impacts of governmental governance change in terms of what was possible inside the SEZ and what was possible outside. But in one of the Chongjunsuen in Boan, which is just beyond the boundary of Shenzhen, I spent a week with talking to migrants, but also working with the Juweiwei, who had actually just been displaced in election by, or they had displaced an old Juweiwei. But one of the stories they told was when the Shenzhen was first being established, the measurement of the land through which the Chongjunsuen was defined, was demarcated, had to be done very rapidly. And so people were actually, the inspectors came down from Beijing and measured this by a particular fruit tree, and they worked out how many acres of land were covered by these fruit trees in that particular part of Shenzhen. And he told me the story of how when the inspectors were there, they made sure they took them each night. They took them out to have a drink and a meal, and while they were having a drink and a meal, they went out and took up all the trees and replanted them in another part of the land. And so the actual demarcation of where the village is a kind of product of a certain kind of design. But it's a design. This is almost Gogolesque, right? I mean, this is a moment through which, as the inspectors are sleeping, the fields grow, the cultivation. That sense, if you know Henry George's work, that notion of the land as being something to be cultivated has a kind of a deep resonance. Tianjin itself, again, for those people who don't know China so well, is part of the Bohai Ring. If the first wave of urban growth in China was very much focused on the Pearl River Delta, the second around the Yangtze River Delta and Shanghai, the third kind of great concentration is frequently talked about as the Bohai Ring, the kind of geopolitical area that ties in Beijing, Tianjin, but also Korea and the eastern seaboard in a way that's deeply strategic. As an area, if you like, that is, I think part is generally received wisdom in most of the work, that whereas when you're talking about a nation of something like 1.5 billion people, the variation in urbanism is extraordinary, but also the distance from Beijing is historically something of profound importance. It was no coincidence that the experiment in Shenzhen was far away from Beijing. The SEZ policy that Deng deployed was something that was experimental, but experimental in areas that were kept safe through design. And so at that geopolitical level, there is a design of urban growth that is not disconnected from the, if you like, the longue durée of Chinese history. And in that sense, the area around Tianjin, which, if you remember those kind of axioms that I put up at the beginning, is frequently talked about as one of the more socialist cities of China. It's one also of the first generation SEZs, but the Tianjin Economic Development Zone moved much less rapidly than many of the other SEZs, and there are all sorts of reasons for this. But if you actually spend time there now, at the moment, there is a sense of extraordinary change. There is, particularly with the change from Hu Jintao, from the influence of Shanghai, the worry about the influence of Shanghai, some of the concerns about some of the things that happened in Shanghai over the last 7 or 8 years, which kind of came to a head a couple of years ago with the departure of the mayor and so on. There's been a more recent focus on the Bohai Ring, and the pace of change in Tianjin right now, in contrast to over the last 20 years or so, is extraordinary. So if you go there right now, when we went there, one of the architects working in Tianjin said, when we first visited him, he said, welcome to Bin Laden City. The difference of Tianjin is that we blew it up ourselves. And there was a notion that this city is changing incredibly rapidly at the moment, but also has a particular kind of legacy from a pace of change in the 1970s. There is a kind of juxtaposition between a land reclamation project that would make a notion of creative destruction look kind of positively modest, that spreads out eastwards across the sea, that includes an aircraft carrier theme park, that includes a new eco-city. But if you look at it, it is a tabula rasa. It has been created as a tabula rasa on which to build this new world. And it sits alongside an alternative model of development simultaneously in the heart of TIDA, the heart of the economic development zone. Where in fact what you have is an attempt by Kurta, the architect, but also a number of people who are involved in the attempt to build a Chinatown. As one of the things that Deng did was to try and experiment with property markets by sending a team of people to London to build a Chinatown in the east of London. The project fell apart in the late 1980s downturn of the property markets in London. But what happened was that same team of people were brought back to Tianjin and were involved in setting up the Tianjin Economic Development Area. And so what they actually tried to do was they imported a master planner, architects, who were largely from the Canadian connections with the Olympia and York Development Company. So there is, if you like, a reproduction of a certain kind of technocratic expertise, a certain kind of the design of the City Hall, which tries to invoke a notion of transparency, but also tries to generate value by installing a green park zone through which you address the externalities of development, and then on top of that produce a new central city. If you think about again, it's maybe less relevant to people here, but if you think about the arguments from Pareto to Coase about how we manage the interface again between risk, uncertainty, and externalities in urban change, that notion of a political economy that informs this might be addressed by a way of preempting certain kinds of thinking about, in Tianjin's case, the way in which value is generated by producing high quality environment on the ground. The master plan was effectively a notion of taking a piece of the town centre and growing it. And what you will find is this extraordinary sense of two projects that now exist simultaneously, cheek by jowl, one juxtaposed against the other. The pace of one, which was established in the mid 1980s the mid-1990s, is by China's standards incredibly slow, but is beginning to emerge for better and worse. Alongside this, you have this extraordinary process of destruction and land extension, by which the Hutong in the center of Tianjin have been wiped out, by which the land mass is being extended eastwards to double or triple the size of the city. You have, if you like, a completely paradoxical space of two completely different design projects, one alongside another, which is why I want to just kind of wrap up by coming back to Shanghai to then try and reflect a little bit on some of the things that we were talking about yesterday, because what I think, again, is particular to China but speaks to the experience of the everyday is a notion through which everyday bits of the city, that city of bits, becomes branded through certain kinds of vocabulary, certain kinds of aestheticized practices. There was a discussion, somebody invoked the space of Thames Town. At one stage there was a notion of theme towns of Shanghai, that Shanghai would have a series of settlements that would be German town, British town, Scandinavian town. Several of these have been built, one of which somebody mentioned yesterday is Thames Town at Songjiang, just out here to the west, through which, if you like, a simulacrum of a generic British city has been created. And that notion of branding these bits of the city, I think has become so routinized. You'll find it on almost every real estate sales pack that you come across. There is a sense in which the parts of the city themselves become branded, and in the context of individual projects, the individual neighborhoods, the Zhaochu, which sometimes I think are wrongly characterized as kind of replicating the gated communities of the West. The Zhaochu need to be thematized, they need to be branded, they need to be characterized and designed in ways which, the water city, the city garden over the river. You should just see a few of these lifestyle products that, again, in many ways we may be familiar with, but are themselves simultaneously, if you like, characterized by different kinds of links between redevelopment, the nail houses that are moved, the people that are displaced, alongside these new forms of lifestyle that are being commodified. There is a phrase that's frequently used is that as people begin to, one of the main debates that you'll find is around the affordability of much of the Zhaochu. And there's kind of paradoxical ways in which those that are displaced, frequently, one of the things that in the ethnographic work that we've been doing, that Tyler's been following a settlement that's been displaced, and how the forms of renegotiation of land actually are not quite so straightforward as you might think, in terms of a juxtaposition between the powerful and the powerless that are straightforwardly wiped away. There is a way in which the negotiating process works in this kind of Mobius Strip interface of state and market, through which frequently the people that come out best are the areas that are, for example, the World Expo site. The people who have been displaced from that for fairly obvious reasons have been actually received pretty good housing as a result, not least if you compare it with many equivalents in the West. It is a process also, though, by which others are simultaneously in extraordinary levels of debt, what people sometimes talk about as the Fengnu, the house slaves, as the mortgage emerges as a form of living, a new form of living, alongside these branded pieces, bits of the urban landscape. There's a sense in which, in Stratford, in Mesopotamia, in these individual landscapes, this is River City. I just want to jump forward so you see at least a little bit of in Thames Town itself, you'll find Michael's Fish and Chip Shop. You'll find replicas of Winston Churchill. You'll find you actually have Miles Davis in Thames Town, which is quite an interesting kind of remapping in itself. The point I'm trying to make, I guess, is that this process of rebranding is precisely something that might make us think a little bit about the sorts of monumentality that exist in the everyday. It might make us actually think, just to try and wrap up, I guess, about how we are juxtaposing notions of creativity. I thought it was quite interesting yesterday that although we talked quite a lot about design and artifice, the notion of creativity was in a way slightly elusive. But also we might begin to think about these forms of urbanism that have genealogies that take us back to, if you like, the cultural production of property rights. And in a sense, the existence of where you have a situation where property itself, largely with the exception of the villages in the city, either in Shanghai or Shenzhen, property itself is still socialized. There are different kinds of property relations at stake. If we think about that notion of property as a bundle of rights, we also need to recognize that in a situation where those rights are fuzzy rather than clear, there is a continual transactional sense of something that is always postponed, something that is, if you like, a relational market rather than a market of the West. It actually might take us back to both, if you like, a critique of the production of the market in convention Western neoliberal sense. I think what is interesting about the Foucault lectures that came out a couple of years ago that are included in the readings is that in kind of Foucault's usual way, they are both brilliant and slightly sketchy on the history, but the importance of the historical might make us think seriously about the ways in which the influence of figures such as Coase and the law and economics movement have actually transformed what it means to be marketized and commodified in the West, but simultaneously about how this is otherwise in a situation where you move away from the socialization of land in itself. That notion of shuizhiwan, that we might think about what petty bourgeois socialism means, might take us into a slightly different reading of what is going on in contemporary China. There is in much of the kind of China studies literature, I think, a kind of almost like a sloppy immediate take that what is happening can be explained through the lenses, through the vocabularies of the neoliberal, through the notion of the generation of civil society, through the notion of a public realm, all of which are deeply Western concepts in a very specifically genealogical sense. And whereas there might be a way of, I guess, of thinking biopolitically, but thinking otherwise about what kinds of emergent subjectivities might be being produced, what kinds of power relations are structured by alternative constructions of the notion of economic externalities, for example. What it means, the architectural theorist Le Chao has tried to argue that if you think through this in a context part, the reason for showing Shenzhen, I guess, was that the property model that came out of Hong Kong, where a monopoly control is taken by the state and the land market is then simultaneously managed by the state and developed very rapidly as the price for getting access to that monopoly market was imported into Shenzhen. And the argument from Shenzhen is frequently that market is then exported from Shenzhen to the rest of China in the 1990s. In Shanghai, it's frequently contested that what distinguishes Shanghai's speed was the ability to build up effectively a sovereign wealth fund of the city itself to generate extraordinary pace of investment. Again, the intertwining of where the state ends and the market begins is much more complicated than is frequently given house room in the ways in which it is discussed in literatures. But also, I suppose, what we might think about in understanding that kind of vernacular biopolitics is the ways in which the spaces of the city that are ostensibly designed allow both opportunities for the kinds of autonomy that you find in the Chongjunsuen, but also the kinds of extraordinary creativities, I guess, that I was trying to exemplify with the spaces such as Dafen. That kind of thinking might actually produce something that opens up a notion of design differently, not to orientalize the experience here, but actually reflect back on making strange the processes of the contemporary globe, precisely because the Mobius strip is actually simultaneously present in the spaces of the West as much as in China. There is a way in which I think it is possible to learn from the urbanism of China to return that to the West. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, is that okay?
So we've got about 15 minutes until the break. What we're going to do is just take clarification questions, right? Not critical comments or critical innovations. They'll follow. You have plenty of time for that. But anything you want clarified or elaborated in terms of the architecture of the argument, the logic of the now's the time to ask. Yeah, could we get a mic?
I don't know. Hi, Professor Kiss. Usually, we Chinese called Deng Xiaoping our extra leader, our general designer. However, Deng Xiaoping told us that we should keep moving forward while find our way at the same time. We have no specific goal. So, according to you, who do you think that is the more powerful designer in China? The government represented by Deng Xiaoping, or the market that's the invisible force pushing our forward? And also, can you call this kind of development in China a design, because that's a design without a plan? And because Deng told we do not have a blueprint. And so can you can we call it a post-design, a kind of post-design without a plan? Thank you.
Sorry, could you just say that last bit again? The last...
Yeah, I mean, since the development in China is a development without any plan, and so can you call it a design or a kind of new design, or we can call it a post-design?
Okay. I think in terms, one of the interesting things about Dong, as I'm sure you know, is that if you go to Shenzhen itself, that I have some images in several parts of Shenzhen, where you find the tableau of progress of contemporary China. You find representations of Deng alongside representations of Mao Zedong. And in fact, at one stage, this became so prominent in Shenzhen that people were told to take down two of the statues of Deng because there was an issue about how significant he was becoming within the narratives through which Shenzhen told a story to itself about the genesis of the city. And I think the point equally that if you actually go to Shenzhen, there's, I think I've got a piece that I looked up last night. To think about Shenzhen as either the market or as the state actually kind of begins to escape some of the complexities of what's happened in places like Shenzhen itself. So frequently you'll see in some of the books, people talk about foreign direct investment, FDI, being the source of very rapid growth in the SEZs. But then if you actually look at some of the big early growth, particularly in Shenzhen. You've got, well, even today, large travel firms like China Travel, Nanyu Holdings, which have extraordinary kind of land holdings, but also employment growth. They actually come out of the SOEs. So exactly what is state-owned and what is not, as people probably around this room already know, it's possible to have different share structures where some shares are traded on the Shanghai market, some shares are traded on the Hong Kong market. Exactly what is a private company and what is not a private company is more complex than it emerges at first. The point that I try and make is that I think it is not the rhetorics that one finds sometimes in China, frequently outside China, that kind of proclaim either state or market are almost a kind of dead-end debate. What becomes more important then, I think why China, the China model is so important, is that there's an argument that there is emergent a Beijing consensus, if you like, that is juxtaposed to the Washington consensus, which involves a different kind of articulation of state and market. It involves a different way of thinking, which is, as with the Washington consensus, is problematic, but creates a different kind of model, a form of relational marketplace that is, in a sense, ontologically very different from the Western experience. And I think that's why, well, apart from anything else, I think it's important that why the West learns from what is happening in today's China, and why what's happening in today's China is so important in the way it speaks to the rest of the world.
This is clarification.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Julie. I just had a further clarification, more information about the two examples of displacement that you mentioned briefly.
Yeah.
You talked about the Three Gorges Dam. Some of the people displaced ended up on Chongming Island.
Yeah.
And was that how did that happen? And the second, you said something about the expo site. The people who were displaced by that, they got better housing. And I wanted to know, could you just talk a little bit more about that? Where did they go? How do you know it has better housing? What is that based on?
Happily, what if you take the second example first, we actually spent some time interviewing some people who were displaced, and what was striking about it was and this was, I mean, crudely put, people were telling stories about a lot of the displacement worked out on a per capita basis. And because there was such urgency to generate speed around the expo itself, there was a facility through which people were basically bringing their families into the housing, so that when, notwithstanding issues of hukou and registration and the complexities of it, they were actually managed to produce a situation where one household managed to produce enough money through compensation to get three new flats, as one example. What we've done actually as part of the work is actually follow some of the cases of displacement tied into the real estate ethnography, and look at the ways in which, if you like, crudely put, so some of both the Danwei tradition, the notion of rights, responsibilities, but a notion of what people expect, plays in such a way that people are even kind of quite choosy about the kinds of property development company that they want to see developing their sites. There's a very different articulation crudely a different articulation of power relations at its most fundamental level in some of the examples that you follow with some of the nail households. Now this is, I don't want this to kind of sound kind of utopian or simplistic at that level, but the point I'm trying to make is that the political economy through which these forms of change are articulated have a particular kind of history, where 35 years ago, all housing was, or a large majority of housing in Shanghai was Danwei based. The Danwei system is still incredibly influential. There's a scholar, David Bray, that people will know, that says that, you know, if you underestimate the persistent legacy of the Danwei system in the contemporary China. You do so at your peril. When you walk out of here and you look at the shop fronts and you find out how many of the shop fronts are owned by Danwei, when you look at the Shanghai property market, and for all that people were talking about the Chaofengzi, the Wenzhou, I mean, when we were talking yesterday about the Wenzhou migrants coming and buying up tracts of property, large amounts of the property that in Shanghai have been bought by the Danwei system. So the Danwei system becomes, again, I mean, there's exactly how one characterizes these developments are interesting as well, but they become sources of new forms of housing. So I think the actors, I think, are fundamentally different, which means that the drama of displacement becomes set within different kinds of configurations of power and powerlessness. And I think it's important to then think through how the specificities of that play out. Is that?
This is just a clarification question, but I was just wondering about your use of the term Mobius Strip, which is usually discussed in mathematics, and what the value of using Mobius Strip as a model for, discussing design in China is, or urban landscapes in China is.
Okay. I think the Mobius Strip, when you follow it, has no inside and no outside, right? And I suppose the point of the point of the metaphor is one that, as I say, is taken from Shui Jiwen's work when he tries to talk about how you should describe rights, property, and property relations in contemporary China. And it's not in a different sort of way. I suppose it's a similar point to the point that Michel Foucault makes when he tries to argue that we should think about the relationship between the state and the social as transactional rather than mapped, in the sense that the boundary is permeable to various extents. And so the notion that Shui Jiwen is deploying is that as you move from the socialization of ownership to something else, that then simultaneously exactly where the inside of the state is and the outside of the state is not clear, just as the inside of the market and the outside of the market are not clear. This does make, I think, for a very different kind of landscape when one is thinking not just about the design of spaces of the city, but debates around intellectual property, for example, which we kind of partly touched on yesterday. So when one thinks about what it means to be able to walk down the road here and simultaneously, buy the DVDs or buy a current version of Word for 200 kwai off the street and so on. The ways in which we think about IP, about originality, about copyright, about the boundaries through which the market and the state are simultaneously articulated, I think begin to suggest that the inside and the outside are not quite so clear. So the metaphor of the Mobius Strip, I guess, is something that doesn't have an inside and an outside in a straightforward way. I think for me, that's the power of the metaphor.